Vitamin D3 is known to also be anti-allergic. Right. And about 40% of the people lack vitamin D3 regardless of sunshine, because they think that if I am actually in the sun, I'm going to get it. But we have provitamin D in the skin that has to go through eventually both the liver and the kidneys to become active vitamin D3. So in all of those individuals, I'm a proponent of giving about 5,000 units a day of vitamin D3.
Welcome to the Hope and Help podcast, where we talk about science and science-based tools for fatigue and chronic illness. Hi, friends. I am your host, Haley Pomeroy, #1 New York Times bestselling author of the Fast Metabolism Diet book. I'm a leading health and wellness expert. I'm also a PhD student in Neuro-Immunology right now. And as always, a fierce advocate for those in need of a little bit of help and hope. Today, we're going to be talking about multiple chemical sensitivity. I think given the time and the conversation that's happening right now, looking at what all these chemicals are doing in our actual body, what it actually means for the individual is important. So I am joined with our professor of clinical immunology. He is the executive director of the Center for Excellence of Neuroinflammation Research, Dr. Theoharis Theoharides. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
It was a real pleasure to be with you once more, Haley. All excited.
Your podcasts have just gone crazy. Everybody loves the science that you bring to us in a way that I think we can apply it to real life. Just so you know, I'm going to brag just for a second, Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris is Yale School of Medicine, Doctor of Medicine, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, Certificate of Global Leadership and Management, Yale University, Doctor of Philosophy, Pharmacology, Yale University Masters of Philosophy and Immunopharmacology, Yale University Masters in Science and Neuro-Immunology, and many, many other things. I think, Dr. Harris, what has been resonating with so many of our community members is, one, your compassion and empathy for what they're going through, but also giving us some real life practical data that we can use to change our lives. So I just wanted to reflect that back from you, what's kind of happening in the community around you being on this podcast. But let's dive in. I want to talk about multiple chemical sensitivity. How would we define that?
Well, it's almost impossible to define, and it's known by different names, including idiopathic environmental illness. Basically, it's a set of rather complex symptoms that develop after exposure to even tiny amounts of various environmental substances. It could be chemicals like benzene, even alcohol. It could be formaldehyde, found sometimes in the cotton clothes, for instance, so they don't wrinkle. It could be preservatives and dyes found in foods. So the list goes on. And because there's such complicated and multiple triggers, and because people are exposed and they have symptoms even to tiny amounts, many colleagues, unfortunately, don't believe that this is a real problem, unfortunately.
Oh, wow. I was fortunate when I was diagnosed with my autoimmune disorder. They were doing a lot of tracking back in when things changed and what had changed in my health. And one of the most interesting questions that they asked me was, do I get car sick when I'm in traffic? And I thought, and they said that was just, kind of a sometimes overlooked symptom with individuals with multiple chemical sensitivity. I was always sensitive as a kid to perfumes and dyes, and I would rash. But it wasn't until I got a really heavy malathion exposure. I was out past curfew.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. And they were dumping for metfly. We had a metfly issue in California, and we got dumped on with this orange kind of dye. And that was the trigger for my ITP, or my autoimmune disorder.
Goodness.
Yeah, it was, but it was so, I then knew kind of what pushed me over the limit and what to address. But when they talk about multiple chemical sensitivities, are these typically people that you see that are sensitive to cigarette smoke and perfumes? Do they then go around the world being a little bit of the canary in the coal mine once their bodies are out of balance?
Well, first of all, you mentioned something very important concerning yourself.
Yeah.
And that is quite prevalent. Individuals may, in fact, have symptoms when they're exposed, but many of them develop autoimmune problems over a period of the first exposure plus. So looking back, in other words, individuals with various autoimmune problems can link the original symptoms of autoimmunity to such exposures, which again, it's another factor that just doesn't enter into our thinking about what these exposures may do. We usually worry about an immediate reaction, not necessarily the chronic reactions. I think definitely I would call them canary in the mine. I remember I used to travel with a lady with multiple chemical sensitivity and another condition that we would talk about later. And every time we would actually go through customs, of course, we're forced to go through duty-free, and she would absolutely collapse, being hit by so many perfumes. And there was no way around it. You literally have to wear, a chemical mask to go through it.
Duty-free is my nightmare. I literally bring either a thick, it's so funny when I pack, everything, if you look at me, everything has a reason. I pack like a really thick sweatshirt material, and I one of these days I'm going to get in trouble at duty free. I literally put it over my face and just run through duty free. They shouldn't be able to do that, and also in
they shouldn't.
stores.
And I've written to various countries about airports, and no one ever replied. And before we go on, we have to say that even the so-called 3M masks that can prevent, for instance, viruses, etc., that became very prevalent during the pandemic, do not actually clear odors. So one has to have a mask with activated charcoal in it. And there are such masks. So that would be my advice for anybody who's sensitive to odors, especially jet fuel. Because whenever you get to an airport, you smell jet fuel no matter where you are. And that could be very, very, very triggering.
I'm just going to speak personally. It is. It's terrible. And especially if we end up on the runway for a long period of time. Or with clients, I've had the opportunity to travel on private, and it is terrible. I mean,
it is terrible.
Yeah, I always run up to the pilot, and I'm like, is there anything you can do? Can we park differently? Can we close the doors? What can we do? Because for me, my response is nausea first. And we'll talk about this, I get mast cell activation second.
Yes, we will talk about that for sure.
Yes, absolutely. So those of us that feel the chemical response, would it be fair to say that there are many people that are having a negative health, immunological or any impact, even if they're not like me, where they get car sick or sick on the plane with the jet fuel, or like I get hives and rashes and my lips swell? Is it safe to say that, yes, myself and maybe many of our community members are having actual, I can journal it, reactivity, but is it safe to say that it's having a negative impact on everybody?
I dare say that it has an impact on everybody. It's just that some individuals, for reasons that we will discuss shortly, let's call them, are more sensitive, and therefore they're more likely to have both severe symptoms and sort of chronic sequelae of the problem. I mean, we've known people, for instance, that work in offices that were just put together, and the new rug would emanate chemical smells because they use a glue to put the carpet down, for instance. When cleaning crews come in, they use cleaning supplies that are very, very strong in terms of smells, and they linger on for a while. Many, many years ago, there was a big to-do about changing the lighting within buildings. We still haven't solved that problem. There's certain types of lights, especially fluorescent lights, that actually have a tremendous impact, and they're likely to cause migraine, headaches, and dysautonomia, where people get disoriented. I remember checking in a hotel in Europe some years ago, and it was like a 5-star hotel. But the moment you walked onto the carpet, you could smell it. And I don't know what they had used or the cleaning supplies, but even I, that don't have anything that I would consider as allergies, etc., was absolutely bothered. I couldn't breathe. So you can imagine other people that are so sensitive. So I think it's difficult for many companies and organizations because, you're likely to have, problems with people working in the environment. And then what do you do? Like recently, we heard in the news, many schools in a particular state had lead, and no one is there to actually even inspect or tell them how to remove the lead, etc. And we're talking now, 2025, we're still dealing with lead problems?
Exactly.
I mean, give me a break.
And we're having cluster of both infection and disease like glioblastoma. I mean, in clusters and work environments too, which
Right.
we are, which I love the fact that we're looking at the environmental factors that contribute to that. There's a couple tips that I want to go through when people are traveling. And I think definitely if you have chemical sensitivity, but also if you're an individual that just wants to not burden the body. I always say this with my clients is, you may not react like I do. And maybe that's because you're more functional at detoxification. Maybe you don't have methylation problems. Maybe you didn't have a big burden. You don't have an autoimmune disorder. But I will tell you that if there's something to be filtered, you are the filter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I would love to see products like Febreze, not even be allowed to be in a public setting. I mean, that's my kryptonite personally. But one thing that I'll say is all the flowery scents and that are there because the belief system is that the consumer wants it. So I always say be vocal. Like every hotel I've ever walked into that has scented sheets or scented carpets or carpet. The very first thing that I do, and I appreciate that you said that you write a note. I send an email. I write a note. I go to the front desk. I leave a note. I make sure that they know how many times I plan on visiting that hotel. Be a positive change, because they're not spending that money for no reason. They're doing it because they think the consumer actually wants it.
Right. There is an organization out of the Charité Hospital in Berlin, and it can actually inspect upon request hospital facilities, hotels, spas, whatever, to be absolutely free of anything that might be associated with multiple chemical sensitivity. So no smelly soaps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, not to go into it. And I think that's something we should actually promote for the United States as well, so that at least individuals who are sensitive can select the place where they're safe, to the extent that they're safe, because we obviously walk around everywhere. I had a patient who had actually an RV outfitted with special filters and would only travel with the RV because, he was so sensitive. But what triggered me and what got me very interested is that all the triggers that are associated with multiple chemical sensitivity are triggers of this unique immune cell called the mast cell, which brings us to mast cell activation disorders.
You're about to go brilliant here on me, and I'm very excited about it, but I want to say one thing to our community. We've used the word sensitive to chemicals. And I know sometimes for myself and also for a lot of individuals in the community member, the word sensitive sometimes can implicate that you're not very strong or robust. And a lot of people like me, successful, type A, physically strong. I ride, 1,400-pound horses, right? When someone says to me, I'm sensitive to perfume, I just feel like that projects a layer of weakness on myself. But why I love the Institute, and especially you, Dr. Harris, is because you have, for a lot of our community members, and for me personally, made me be able to understand that I'm actually having an immunological response. It's not that I just can't deal with it, right? That I'm actually having an immunological response. And I'm fortunate in the fact that I get raspberries and my lips swell and I get blisters, right? So no one can say, oh, she's just picky, right, about her linens in a hotel. And that sounds terrible that I have to say I'm lucky that I have physical manifestation of what you're going to go into, mast cell activation. But there are so many people that have things like anxiety, depression. I see children that in schools are so dirty, but I see children that walk into hotels that their parents say, they're acting like a little maniac here. And they're sleeping on bed sheets that are scented and perfumed and have fungicides and all kinds with the bed bugs. There's all kinds of chemicals now in hotel rooms that we used to not have before. So I just want to throw that out there, that the word sensitivity itself, I think sometimes makes it seem like you could muscle through it. We're going to now jump into, and this is why I brought you on here to talk about this, into what's happening in the body so that people can feel more confident and solidified in listening to their body. Because sometimes it's just fatigue or brain fog or cognitive issues. And that is profound. I didn't need to use the word just, but it's easier when someone like me blisters out. I go, hey, your sheets cause blisters. Let's get something different, right?
Sure.
So please explain to me what's happening in the immune system in individuals like us.
Okay, so you're absolutely right, first of all, by saying that there's so many symptoms involving the brain and the nervous system in general, which complicate things even more. This is why it's music to my ears, because when these immune cells called the mast cells, which are found everywhere in the body, including the brain, get activated, they can release chemicals that can affect every organ of the body, every tissue of the body, not necessarily all of them at the same time, but eventually all of them are affected. Most of the time, it is the actual chemicals.
Okay.
So the mast cells have been known primarily to react to what is called immunoglobulin E, or Ig, an antigen, but that's one of about 300 receptors they have actually on their surface. So they can respond to chemicals, to fungi, to bacteria, to viruses, to stress, changes in temperature, changes in vibration. So clearly, the allergic part is the tip of the iceberg. Now, in addition to the mast cell responding directly to these chemicals, it can respond indirectly as well. For instance, when we smell, the odors will be picked up through the olfactory nerve at the part of the brain that regulates homeostasis, so the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. Now, CRH will stimulate the mast cells. It's a second layer of activation now, and resets the reactivity to practically everything.
Is that so that, sorry, but so we smell it, at the hypothalamus, it goes up the olfactory nerve, and then the hypothalamus responds. And is that kind of our primal immune response? So to protect us?
Well, it is, because, millions of years ago, we didn't have perfumes. We and animals will smell danger, basically. And that's the important thing. So we literally smell danger. And this danger puts us into this fight or flight reaction, which triggers the mast cells to now release chemicals to orchestrate a response to that danger. And what is also important, many papers have published that acute either physiological, psychological stress can worsen chemical sensitivities. And that brings us back to exactly what we discussed. A stressful trigger, whether it's physiological, an infection, or psychological, dealing with whatever difficult circumstances, will release this hormone CRH, which will bring us back to exactly what we discussed. And the reason I like invoking the mast cell is not only because I know how it reacts, I know that the trigger is almost identical, but as you said earlier, now we have a succinct physiological response. It's not sensitivity anymore. It is the mast cells are activated, and they can release chemicals that can cause all the problems that these individuals are actually describing. This is why in the United States, there's no diagnostic code for multiple chemical sensitivity. So they use different other codes. Unfortunately, one is a psychosomatic disease, which is, nonsense. So I always say that the code we should be using is mast cell activation unspecified. So there are many different triggers. We might not know all the triggers, but if the mast cells are triggered, they will actually cause the problems we're talking about. And the importance of the stress and the CRH is it lowers the bar. So while you might have needed, let's say, 100 units of something to trigger the mast cells, now you need 10 units of whatever it is, which brings us to the definition of multiple chemical sensitivity, that even small amounts of triggers can actually trigger the symptoms.
So Dr. Harris, I'm going to take us back just a second. When you talked about the diagnostic code, which is mast cell activation
Unspecified.
Unspecified. Who typically does that? Is that usually, do you usually go to an immunologist or an allergist? Who could you talk to about this issue?
Well, the diagnostic codes should be known to everybody. Unfortunately, the first person that you will encounter will be your general practitioner or a pediatrician or internist.
Okay.
And the moment they hear multiple symptoms and sensitivities, they're probably going to send you to an allergist.
Okay.
And the allergist invariably doesn't believe that this is real. So you're stuck now because you don't know where to go anymore.
Right.
And this is why our institute is so unique, because we're not going to, side guess you. We hear what you have, and we'll try to get to the bottom of it. And as we will discuss in a few minutes, believing that to a very large extent, it is mast cell activation that is involved in every individual who is sensitive feeling the symptoms. If we block the mast cells, we will do a lot of good no matter what the triggers might be.
So let me, for those individuals that haven't seen the podcasts that have come before this on mast cell, can you take us back and explain exactly, what is a mast cell? I love that the topic is so hot right now, but what is a mast cell and what does mast cell activation mean in our body?
Sure. So mast cells are unique issue immune cells. They come from the bone marrow, but they do not circulate as mature cells. So they go into the blood and they go into the tissues, and they take different characteristics depending what tissue there is. They're invariably found around blood vessels and next to nerve endings, uniquely. And they're found in all organs exposed to the outside world, such as eyes, nose, mouth, lungs, skin, gut. And not only they sense what's happening on the outside world, but they throw philopodia, little tentacles, between the cells that make up the blood vessels, called endothelial cells, and they sense what's happening inside the blood as well. So that's why you said, canary in the mine is exactly right. And in the brain, they're found specifically around what protects the brain, called the blood-brain barrier, and in the part of the brain that regulates all our body functions, called homeostasis, which is the hypothalamus and the hippocampus and amygdala, all those areas. So once the mast cell is stimulated, it has, think of it about a soccer ball with about 1,000 ping pong balls. Each ping pong ball having about 100 or so different chemicals.
Okay.
So if you get into an anaphylactic reaction, which is the worst, the cell will explode, will release the content of all these 1,000 granules, and in the course of about 6 hours, will create another 100 molecules to be released. This is called the late phase reaction. And yet, out of these 300 or so molecules that the mast cell releases, we only deal with primarily one histamine and another one that constricts the bronchi called leukotrienes. We have no idea what the others do, including proteolytic enzymes, called the meat tenderizers, like tryptase and chymase. It's a phenomenal cell, and we just don't have good ways to basically lock it up. And once it releases, within 24 hours, it restocks itself, and it's ready to go again. It doesn't die.
Wow. So we typically think of mast cells, a lot of the research is in like you said, leukotrienes, in the lung response, and in histamine.
Right.
But there's many other components. Like
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and some of, like, when you get a bee sting or you get a bug bite, some of those enzymes are active in creating I always call them a rat.
Yeah, the wheel and the itching and the redness.
Okay.
But the first thing I do, if I suspect that someone may have such issues, or they come in and they tell me I have such issues, what you can do is basically just roll up the sleeve and just scratch the underarm, just one continuous scratch. If that scratch turns red in about 2 minutes, I know there are mast cell and chemical sensitivity issues, because that tells me that just the pressure of the scratch triggered the mast cells. There was no allergen there. There's no IgE.
It was just trauma to the tissue.
Correct.
So are there certain biomarkers? Like, I know that you had just talked about a diagnostic code. Are there certain tests that a person can have run if they suspect this? I mean, again, for me, it's really obvious. My dad was one that would talk a lot about and it was kind of interesting. He did chemical engineering and was in a chemical spill himself, and he ended up with Bell's palsy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was really interesting as a result of it, and had a full recovery. We did a lot of detox and antioxidants and stuff like that. Had a full recovery, but he always was chemical sensitive. Like, no way. We would think about which department store entrance we would go into.
Right.
But when we were looking at labs to run, and we were also looking at other biomarkers, if a person feels, like they need some sort of medical definition for this, what kind of labs do you run in your clinic?
Well, the quickest thing, which we don't do in the clinic here, is to do basically a skin test with any molecule that is likely to trigger a reaction.
Okay.
And the reason I'm saying the skin test is in the blood, the RAS test looks for specific IgE antibodies. But as I said earlier, most of the reactions in chemical sensitivity are not through IgE, so that turned to be actually negative. When we skin test, it covers both those reactions that might be through IgE as well as direct activation. I'll give you an example. If we want to see if someone responds to molecules that are positively charged, we will inject a little bit of morphine in the skin, and that will trigger the mast cells. That's not IgE.
Right.
So therefore, an allergist who is interested in doing this can have a panel of about 100 different triggers and can inject tiny amounts and see if there's a local reaction. And the reaction will be just like the scratching that I mentioned a minute ago, but in this case will be the injection. So if in fact they respond to that, number one, you know that they responded. Therefore, you know at least some of the triggers, even though the individuals probably already know the triggers anyhow. So that's just confirmatory. But it's also telling us that the first approach would be avoid the trigger once you know the trigger.
Avoid.
And number two, in certain cases, you can do basically immunotherapy, meaning that if you give tiny amounts of something, over time, the body gets used to it and doesn't respond anymore. For foods, it's sublingual. For other molecules, it's not sublingual. Go ahead.
Do you find it effective once a person has multiple chemical sensitivity, unless you help kind of restore the person's gut? Like I've had a lot of allergists refer individuals because they're not as responsive. I mean, we do everything from homeopathic tinctures of remedies to where the allergist does the injections or a food dilution. But a lot of times the docs will send people to me in our practice because we need to first heal the gut, reduce the systemic inflammation for them to be responsive. Once they've gone to the point where there are multiple chemical sensitivity. I mean, it's not like we're, an individual that maybe has some anesthesia and we're working on for surgery, we're working on detox for that episodic event. But usually by the time they get to the INM or my personal clinic, when we're in the multiple chemical sensitivity perspective, the system of their body.
No. I agree with you 100%. First of all, even the desensitization, as we call it, whether it's homeopathy or small amounts or whatever, doesn't work for every antigen or every trigger. And these individuals have so many triggers, it becomes almost a nonsensical approach to try to cover them. That's why our approach has always been to block the mast cells.
Yes.
And blocking the mast cells, it's not only helpful in typical allergies, not only helpful in what is called mast cell activation disorders, of which I consider multiple chemical sensitivity to be one, but it blocks the mast cells from further sensitivities and allows basically any other approach to work better. But coming back to your point, since we know that the gut-brain axis is very active and microbiome very active, we do have to bring a balance to the body first.
Yeah.
And therefore, yes, we will look at vitamins, we would look at foods. There are foods that trigger the mast cells. There are foods that have histamine that makes things worse in addition to triggering the mast cells. So all of those have to be reduced or eliminated first, and then come in with, the second phase of the approach.
And in our community, we use the philosophy of remove, right? Restore. So try to identify or isolate what it is, or maybe if there's 100 of them If there's 3 that you can control, it gives your body, like, get the cleaning products out of your house, get the perfume off your body, look at what lotions you're using. We do what we call the detox your world.
Absolutely.
Then detox your body.
Absolutely.
There has to be a restore balance, or the ideal homeostasis, and then reinoculate, right? And so in our community, it's a multiple step approach, and every body is different. I want to circle back to something that you said, because it's definitely a reality in my world, is understanding why when I'm under stress, and this is where some of the psychological piece comes in. People say, you're just stressed. When I am under stress, I am 10 times more reactive.
As we discussed earlier, the brain will release CRH. CRH is released not only in the brain, but we were among the first to show it's released in the skin and in the gut and in the bladder. And it will reset the reactivity of the mast cells. So the mast cells are now firing easier and to many more triggers. That's why it's so important to block the mast cells. And as you know, and we discussed in the past, some natural molecules can actually block the mast cells, such as, for instance, the flavonoid luteolin, except that those are not absorbed very well from the intestine. That's why I help make them as liposomes by mixing them up with olive oil that increases absorption from the gut, such as one, for instance, that's called Pure Lute, which is pure luteolin made by the company Algonaut. But coming back to what you were saying earlier, vitamin D3 is known to also be anti-allergic. Right. And about 40% of the people lack vitamin D3 regardless of sunshine, because they think that if I am actually in the sun, I'm going to get it. But we have provitamin D in the skin that has to go through eventually both the liver and the kidneys to become active vitamin D3. So in all of those individuals, I'm a proponent of giving about 5,000 units a day of vitamin D3.
And you know what, Dr. Harris, one of the things, I have a little travel kit that I carry with me. And one of the things that I take, beet-derived vitamin C in 3 grams. I take a large dose of vitamin C. But I will take D3K2 at time of exposure. And I cannot tell you, I was an immunologist friend of mine talked to me about that. And, I take D3K2 all the time. I'm a woman. I've gone through menopause.
Sure.
I drive my D levels to, minimum 60 to 90, around in that range. I like to play. But using it transiently was introduced to me. And it was, I love that you brought that up, because it was really, really made a change for me. So if I'm going to get ready to get on a plane, I take an extra D3K2 when I walk into a hotel. If I'm going through the airport, like you said, customs, it's really, and it's, even though it's a fat soluble vitamin, it really has a strong effect. And I won't say that it's an antihistamine, like you said, the bioflavonoids, but what it does for me is it makes me less sensitive. So I feel stronger and heartier and less reactive. So I love that you brought that up.
So going back to what can be measured, I always measure total IgE to the extent that we have bona fide allergies. I measure the subclass IgG1 and IgG4, because the IgG4 is responsible for food intolerance or food sensitivity, if you wish, because it triggers the mast cells through different receptors. I will measure vitamin D3. I will measure glutathione, because glutathione is the only antioxidant our body has, and whenever we're bombarded, we will have oxidative stress. Of course, there are herbal ways to give antioxidants, but I'd like to know what our body does, because we can give glutathione, intranasal, by mouth, by injection, whatever. And I will measure at least 2 other molecules, even though they do not come only from mast cells. I found them very strongly associated with severity of symptoms. So one is interleukin-6, abbreviated uppercase IL-6, and vascular endothelial growth factor, abbreviated VEGF. And both of these can be measured, by many labs, including Quest and LabCorp, etc.
I'm so grateful that you brought those up. We've been looking at those a lot recently, as per your suggest. So everybody out there, we have this amazing experience at the Institute for Neuro-Immune Medicine, and that's where on Fridays we have a clinical meeting every Friday at 9 a.m. and all the docs and we have a lot of medical students that come in because they love to learn, they need to learn, the doctors of the future need to learn about this stuff. And we talk about cases and Dr. Harris, obviously you're an integral part of that. And you had brought up some of these testing and we've been running them on patients and also, clients that I work with from a nutrition perspective, requesting that their doctors run them. And the correlation has been really profound and it's been nice.
Amazing.
It's been nice to be able to use these biomarkers also as the ability to track, right, our progress. Because what I think is right for somebody or anybody else thinks is right for somebody, if we have consistent biomarkers, the body will tell us if we're going down the right path.
Absolutely. And certain chemicals can be measured. We can do, for instance, we will send out for heavy metals.
Yes.
And just to remind everybody, heavy metals stay in the blood just a couple of months, in the urine about 6 months, and then it's hair and stays forever. So, if you do a blood test and it's negative, that doesn't mean to say you were not exposed.
Exactly.
Same thing with mycotoxins, which are volatile. Now, we tend to think that mycotoxins come only from mold in moldy houses or environments, but about 50% of them comes actually from food. There's mold growing on food all the time. There are a number of laboratories that can measure mycotoxins in the urine. Some colleagues believe them, some don't. I usually tend to ask for at least 2 measurements within 3 months, just because. And I'm not going to mention the laboratories, but there are about 3 laboratories that can do that. And there was one particular case that I was involved in Massachusetts before coming down to Florida, where, as you know, Massachusetts has legalized basically marijuana.
Right.
And there were a number of cases of people getting really sick and no one could figure out. And I have been part of the Massachusetts Drug Formulary Commission, which is equivalent to the FDA, if you wish. I still am on the roster. And I was involved. And it turns out that there was such demand for marijuana that one particular factory was actually storing tons of marijuana and got molded. So when they actually sold the marijuana, people were responding to the mold that was actually in the weed and not the weed itself. So mold is everywhere.
We had a case, kind of a crazy case, where it was what they called it botrytis was the
Yes,
I believe.
yes.
They had a botrytis neurotoxicity response, and it was they went into a complete psychotic state. It was just the crazy. And thank God there was a phenomenal pharmacologist and immunologist and someone that was testing all the mycotoxins. It was crazy. Dr. Harris, this is the kind of things that we are talking about all the time in our clinical applications, which is why I want to thank you for coming into our community here through this podcast and bringing all of this amazing information. Please promise me you are one of our absolute favorites in our community. I know you guys, if you have questions, post your questions below. It helps us develop more podcasts. It helps us create questions for Dr. Harris and beg him to come back on again. Multiple chemical sensitivity is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, that's affecting so many of our patients with chronic disease, autoimmune disorder, ME, CFS, chronic fatigue, as well as myalgic encephalomyelitis. And so it is just an honor to have you, Dr. Harris, here today. And please promise you'll come back.
Of course.